Hi, this is Michael. So I wanted to wrap up nouns this week, and these words, nouns and verbs, are an invention of mine that hopefully helps you understand a little bit about how we're layering some of the problems and breaking them into smaller chunks so that you're not constantly trying to move back and forth between different concepts as to your work as an information architect. So your beginning work was just to get data, to understand the data as best you could. And I want to give you some concrete examples here about these grouping concepts that are really important when it comes to how you're going to have people discover and manipulate this data later. And there are many, many schemes. However, you'll find until we reach the next step, right now we're still trying to take data, find pattern. So we're really kind of in the midst of pattern recognition right now. We want to move that up into solidly be information, which provides a context. That's usually what, in my mind, what constitutes information. There's some context of it being an answer to a question or an example of something, or just browsing through items or to purchase, or any way to interact with if you're going through movies on Netflix. It's just something where the content is there and it's got some context, so you're able to take the design, which could be headings, perhaps an image, or details, and just in that one example of a movie, you can see how browsing through a display on Netflix, you don't see a lot of details. You normally have to click in order to see the director and actors and so forth. But you get a good idea sometimes just from imagery or titles or genres. There is a concept that is a little hard to illustrate, but I'm just going to give an example, which is if you've got a table and you might find that it's very specific about a particular place. And I'll just use place as a placeholder. Yeah, there you go. I'll use place as a placeholder because let's say you say best restaurants in Chicago. And you've got this list of data, and there are a lot of restaurants in Chicago, so that's why counting things is kind of important. Actually, as we move to the next step, counting is going to be extremely important. So let's just pretend that in terms of restaurants in Chicago, there's 10,000 restaurants. It's a lot, but that makes sense. It's a big city. So anyway, 10,000 restaurants in Chicago. So you've got this long, long, long list. However, if you look at your database and it does just assume or start from the point of view that it's in Chicago, what if, to make it a potentially bigger list of restaurants, you could add a location? Simple as that. So if you said city, state. Now, not only could this list be filtered by Chicago fairly easily by location, you can also start to use your data set and all your imaginings about the things that describe that restaurant, all those great descriptive terms and hierarchy, all that stuff is still there, but it could apply then to any restaurant in the United States. A really good example of this concept, and that's in a sense why it makes a lot of sense to specialize when it comes to data collection. But once you've gotten a good data model, universalizing it puts you into the world where information architects really thrive because some of the complexities come from millions of records, not tens of thousands of records. That's why a book, for example, could almost never be a database. It could always be just laid out one by one because you have enough information that you could just publish it. You don't need these data structures and all of this hierarchy if you're organizing that little amount of information, but the power comes from being able to add just a few fields. What would we say? City, state, address. Now, if you wanted to make it even more universal, you could add one more field, which is country. So your data model can scale pretty easily to be about restaurants all over the world. And that concept very famously worked for Uber. Uber started in San Francisco. It tried to solve all the problems of ride sharing and so forth in San Francisco. And once it got a good enough data model and a good enough way of handling those particular trips, it expanded and expanded to the United States and then expanded to the world. And not that there are not unique elements to each country, but it does make it a lot easier that your data model and the way you deal with things can be proven on a small scale and then made extremely large. Part of the reason the internet's kind of such a cool place. So here's a quick review. Are these things in your table? Have you really thought them through? Starting with, this one to me absolutely takes the human touch because there is no right answer. There's some good guesses. There's some patterns we can use, but there's no answer. So number one, we have to have data structures. We want potentially millions of examples. We want to make sure that whatever topic we're talking about models that pretty good, this column name and an attribute, this relationship between, hey, there's something of a column and then there's a data piece. That is the way we're going to start. And then you do need uniqueness, by the way, in a data structure. Things cannot be identical in any way. And you don't want to necessarily, if you can have this discussion with your team or yourself, you don't want to rely upon necessarily an auto-generated number, which is fine. It'll always be unique. But what about each record grouped together makes something unique? And if they're qualitative, meaning they actually do describe something, that's why, as an example, product names usually have some unique identifier after them. So they have maybe a purpose, and then they have a sometimes unbelievably random set of numbers after it that people can see and maybe they even know. For example, I like the X2, or I like the CB27, or the MacBook Air M1. These are, in a sense, made up words, but they do create uniqueness so that in your table you make sure that you're not going to have undue repetition, which can make things a little bit harder to organize later. I say you need some terms that group them into sets. So if everyone has to be unique, you do want terms that group them together. You do want some way to see communalities and groupings, because that's going to help us later, because we don't want to sort things alphabetically, for example. We want to use more focused ways, and that's your taxonomy is a great example of this, a term that might group things. You want a hierarchy to the data field. So we talked about HTML, H1, H2, and then different groups that you can put your data into, such as details or headers or footers, that give them some context in terms of a record. So if you looked at a record with a hierarchy, it is understandable, although probably not very pretty to a person, but we showed that example of how you can always later add style. That's not a problem, but you can't really, without hierarchy, design. It's something that is so entwined with what design is. And then here's a subtle thing. When you're grouping, if you have topics and subtopics, if you have an overabundance of one type, that is a clue that you need to break that down into smaller types. We're going to really, in the next topic, when we talk about verbs or navigation, is you're really limited onto what can go onto a screen. So let me give you some examples. These words at the top of the page here, world, US, politics, etc., they're not completely unique for every newspaper, but they did always serve this function of being able to put different things into a group so that someone could just get to that particular group and get a good idea and not have to search through the entire paper for something that might interest them. And those particular terms still, even in a virtual world, survive to this day, just because that purpose is important. This also, for a newspaper, one thing is time. So it has already a filter of today. So this is where, each of those, and then you could go back into time. So there's a lot of organization already here. It's been proven out. It's been codified. People are used to it, and they want, in order to browse, to see some words like this. In more complex worlds, we can look for, just kind of pick something here from McMaster Carr. There's a lot of different types of things. As you get into each one, the column names and attributes are likely to change. However, this shouldn't be too daunting, because this is a good thing. We do want there to be a high level idea of what's going on, but you can have lots and lots and lots of details. In this case, it's shown in this manner in a table. That isn't necessarily the best way, but it's a good way to compare things if you're trying to compare two different fields. So, or best of all, it's an ability over here to start to create some sort of filter. So nouns, or these words, are really good for filtering, and you can see there's a difficulty here that there aren't a lot of options, but if I did select one, then I can just see this particular one. It'll filter everything out, and if I unclick it, it'll go back. So these words and these attributes that are there to describe things are really helpful for filters. I'm going to just show another couple of examples. By the way, I'm going to give a big shout out to Mural. Mural is the tool that I like to use to be able to explore these ideas with a team, or in this case, this is what I use to gather ideas from students so that we can work together and not do one thing, which is in a database, there is a hierarchy, there is these column names, there's a lot of rigidity to it. Whereas Mural, because it's a sort of a virtual space, it uses some concepts like post-it notes. In this case, you can kind of create a post-it note. But what's good about it is, even though it does seem, with this idea of a header and some things underneath it, that there's some organization or structure, it is really completely unstructured data. And it doesn't fool you too often into thinking that there's something more meaningful behind it, even though if you had everything the same size. We do a lot of this Gestalt theory, which is part of the pattern example in my class that we just went through, is when you're looking for patterns, you can see patterns. Even though there are patterns, it doesn't mean that the information itself has any resonance or connection. So it keeps you a little more honest than it would if you were working in some other tools, even Airtable, because Airtable has that sort of nice rigidity to it. A couple other examples of just some interesting ways to use a taxonomy or use words. In this case, beer. This is a nice example of how many words, subwords, and subtopics are available in order to describe a beer style. This one might be perhaps a little bit more unique, and that's also possible that if you wanted to use words that weren't traditional to describe your products. In this case, it's talking about wine, and it's using words like this and giving even a number behind it. And this is a very powerful concept. If you have just a word, every word in every example using that word is the same. The computer or you can't really tell the difference between the two. But if there's a weight or a number behind it, for example, you've got a genre called rock, and you've got an example record, Led Zeppelin. So you might, in one way or another, rank the Led Zeppelin record at 10, and let's pretend we have 1 to 10 here, as a very rock record. And then you could get another record, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, and you could label that a 3 in the category of rock. So terms and numbers are really helpful. In this example, it might be a little hard to read, but it does give you an idea, especially as you navigate information, what is the most dominant aspect and how much should you emphasize that this emphasis, such as fruity or floral, is very true of this example, but floral and fruity are maybe not so true of another. Really powerful stuff. So another example, just hitting a little closer to home, is a design system. The words around the things that create web pages partly come from HTML, which makes a lot of sense. Inputs and other things, headers, are part of the HTML structure that we already looked at, but there are plenty of other things that are called components that don't come from that, and components are just usually the collections of things that create some sort of function or value. Here's another example of, at least in my own experience, a place that naming really comes in handy, and that's the pieces that go together to create an interface. These words had to be invented, and the first place really, I think, to invent many of these terms was a library that many used called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap came up with things like avatars and badges. And if you look at these badges are just things that have a particular behavior and have a particular meaning. And because you know the name of them, you get a lot of power because you can look at different libraries and you can compare one thing to the other. So the power of these words are extremely important. And the fact that we as designers are speaking a more common language also help us do a better job. Yet still, and for example, dimmer might not be the term that everyone uses. They used to be called light boxes or overlays because they came from the people who invented the code that allows you to use it. These are always evolving, but I still think having language here to help you find things is really critical, especially as you may go ahead and invent it if you didn't know that it already existed and it already was in a library. And then lastly, just one more example. Probably the most common example is a hashtag. So what does a hashtag do? It's got a little bit of history, which was it was actually invented by a user who was using Twitter, and they had that grouping problem, which is that there's a lot of time-based things happening. But if you were, for example, in a place and you didn't necessarily know other people and you weren't following them on Twitter, how would you all talk about the same thing, South by Southwest or some convention, for example? So by using the hashtag, which is often in computers, they just find a key glyph that isn't used that much. Numbers for number one. So for whatever reason, hashtag or pound got used and put in front of words. What that does is just make the word unique. It also signals to the programmers that, hey, this means more than it says. It's not just the word. So just as a quick example, there's some things about hashtags. One thing is that they're almost always entered or created by a user. So that's the ability to either tag or to add a word to describe something for their own purposes, which is they want to join into something or they want to, again, create that grouping needed. A few of the ideas here are compound words. I still believe that the uniqueness of the word is really important here. So even if you're combining very common words such as photo of the day, altogether this might be something extremely unique. Same thing, pick of the day. And otherwise, these are just the same in many respects as using the word itself. If you used this word fitness, it doesn't mean if you don't search or if you search that you will find this word. That's fine. The hashtag itself doesn't add much to it. So normally the compound or made up words are the most powerful because once you know them, you're going to be able to make a much smaller data set that might be easier to go through, parse, and find. So these words, even though they are all doing the same job, describing hierarchies and creating a grouping for your content, I wanted to give you one more last look before we move on to verbs.